It's Moser, and we are going to go back to the creeks. So if you remember, yesterday we left our heroes, the Hellbenders, with faces only a mother could love, though I think they're pretty cute. And we talked about the fact that while the North Fork of Little Beaver Creek has got a breeding population of Hellbenders, Mill Creek, which did have a breeding population of Hellbenders in the 1960s, has not a single Hellbender to its name. So we want to think a little bit more and find out a little bit more about what's happening. Why? Well, because just like a person is a product of their environment, and it's tougher for some people because they haven't had the best care and they haven't had everything they needed, and some people have everything they need. The Hellbender is a product of their environment, the creek, and the creek is a product of the environment around it. What's happening around it? So let's start off with the happy side of our story. Let's start off with the North Fork of Little Beaver Creek. And you may recognize this. It's the Tubbs. So this is actually on the middle branch of Little Beaver Creek, right where the North Fork comes in. And if we look at the North Fork on a map, this is a map that shows the North Fork from about Enon Valley down to Fredericktown. It actually, of course, starts up near Springfield Township, near New Middletown, Springfield, Petersburg, that area. And it kind of winds its way along, sort of paralleling the Pennsylvania Turnpike, takes a little bit of a turn north at Enon Valley, and then turns a sharp south near New Galilee, comes down to Darlington. And this actually parallels Channelton Road, which you may have taken as the shortcut between Negley and Chippewa. That whole valley there is the valley of the North Fork of Little Beaver Creek. Well, then, of course, the creek gets to Negley, and it takes a sharp turn south and heads for Fredericktown, where it will meet up with the Middle Fork. That's a pretty nice run. So let's look at a picture of this area. That's an aerial photo, and I've highlighted the creek in blue. You can see that the state line is sort of faintly showing over here. But that's the North Fork of Beaver Creek from about Negley to Fredericktown. Boy, that's a nice picture. So if I told you you were going to get in the car or get out on foot and head out into the area that's in this picture, what would you expect to see? Well, in class when we discussed this, a lot of people said, trees, duh. Yeah. This area is largely woods, and there are some scattered farm fields here and there, some houses. If we zoom out a little bit, and here's a broader view with the creek and the area around it, we do notice that this is a lot of woods. There's some farm fields. The little towns that are scattered here, well, they're hardly much more than little dots. You can, if you really zoom in on East Palestine, you can see that there are some houses there. Unity is just a wide spot in the road. Enon Valley is not much more than that. Darlington, New Galilee, these are all little teeny tiny towns. Of course, there is thriving downtown Negley, Ohio, but, it's still not a whole lot to write home about. And then it's just woods and hills until you get all the way down to Fredericktown, where we've got another very, very small little crossroads town. You might say there's not a whole lot going on in this neck of the woods. Well, there's something special about this neck of the woods, and I need to introduce you to a term that we're going to be using a lot in the next couple of days. The term is watershed. And you may have heard this word before. I've mentioned it a few times. It is not a little house where they keep the water. A watershed is all the land that drains to a particular stream or pond or lake or river. And this is an illustration. Watershed divides are really easy to see when you've got a mountain divide like this. It's a little bit more subtle back here in the east. This is a nice graphic that someone produced. You can well imagine that when drops of rain fall on the top of this mountain ridge, depending on exactly where they fall, they're either going to roll down this way or they're going to roll that way. And every bit of water that hits the ground and rolls down that way into this imaginary river is covering land that's part of this river's watershed. So the watershed is all the land that drains to the stream. And if we were to go out in the parking lot here at Beaver Local High School with a 5-gallon bucket of water and dump it on the ground, where would it end up? Well, it would end up in the retention pond. Okay, where would it end up after the retention pond? Well, it'd go into a little creek. Where would it go after it went into the little creek? It'd go into the West Fork of Little Beaver Creek. So we are in the West Fork of Little Beaver Creek watershed, because any water that hits the ground here is going to end up in the West Fork of Little Beaver Creek. So if we come back to here, we can kind of outline the land area that's going to drain to this stream. And that's a really rough, ugly approximation, but you can see that a whole lot of that is woods. And I'll tell you what, woods are good for streams. When water hits a forested area, it gets a chance to slow down and soak in. The trees soak some of it up. It filters through soil and gets cleaned. Pollutants are absorbed. It's good. Parking lots and sidewalks and driveways, not as good. So it's easy to see that the North Fork of Little Beaver Creek, well, it's got an easy time being a healthy stream. Look at that watershed. It's beautiful. Here's the watershed for the entire Little Beaver Creek drainage. And we can trace these streams. If you live over in West Point, you're part of the West Fork watershed. And we can see here, this is Guilford Lake. And the West Fork starts there, goes down through Wayne Township and Madison Township until it joins up just north of the high school here with the Middle Fork just past Farmers Golf Course. If you live a little further north, you might be in the Middle Fork watershed. The Middle Fork starts outside of Salem and kind of swings north of Salem into Mahoning County. It comes all the way down to Washingtonville and past Washingtonville and Leetonia. If you've ridden the Greenway bike trail, that's right in this section. And it sort of meanders its way back that way through Salem Township, out towards the edge of Lisbon. You may have been to the little park there off Route 30 in Lisbon. That's the Middle Fork of Little Beaver Creek, and it winds right down, paralleling there. Route 154 runs right through downtown Elkton, the metropolis that it is. Winds its way all the way to here where it joins up with the West Fork. Well, that's great. Then we have the North Fork, and that's, of course, our stream of interest. So here's the North Fork, starting out near New Springfield, Petersburg, heading down this way towards Enon Valley and past New Galilee, through Darlington, and it parallels Channelton Road, crosses the state line, gets to Negley, and takes us south until it meets up with the Middle Fork at Fredericktown. So the watershed for this stream is all of this, because Bull Creek and Little Bull Creek's the one that flows through New Waterford, those are part of this watershed. Little Bull Creek comes from up near, maybe they both start near New Waterford, I'd have to look. The ones that pass through Camp Frederick, the church camp in Negley, that's Bull Creek and Little Bull Creek, and they come together just outside of Negley, just before they join the North Fork. So that's the North Fork watershed. It's pretty rural. It's fairly wooded. Like I said, it's easy to see why the North Fork is a healthy creek. But now, let's talk about a creek that hasn't had such an easy time. So that's Mill Creek. It runs from Columbiana all the way up to downtown Youngstown. And, well, Mill Creek it's had its share of. There's Mill Creek on a map, and at a first glance, we still see lots of green here, but something changes in this watershed. And when I say Mill Creek's had problems, I mean it. We can already see, just by looking at this, that the area that drains to Mill Creek, the Mill Creek watershed, looks a little bit different than the North Fork of Little Beaver Creek watershed did. Can't really pick it out from a map this far away, but it sure does look like it's different colors. Problems, you say? Yeah, problems. So there are 3 lakes on Mill Creek made by dams on the creek, and Lake Newport's commonly used for kayaking, except when it's closed because there are high levels of E. coli bacteria in it. Oh, where does E. coli come from? Let's see, E. coli bacteria. I know I've heard this someplace before. Where does E. coli come from? Oh, yeah, poop! What? Ah, there's poop in the creek? Ew, that's gross. How do we get poop in the creek? Poop shouldn't be in a creek unless it's fish poop. Good grief. Well, I'm glad you asked. How did the poop get in the creek? So, for a very long time, humans have been pooping. Everything poops. It's just the facts. And humans, over the course of our history, have found increasingly, sophisticated ways to deal with this fact. First, we just dug holes and pooped in them and then filled them in. But then we got a little smarter, and we went to the outhouse model, where you dig a big hole and then you put a toilet of some sort over it and you poop in the hole, and eventually you move the outhouse. So, humans did that for a long time. And, it's a little dicey because the poop can kind of leach into the groundwater sitting there all that time. So, that might not be a great thing. Well, we've moved up in the world, and we now have septic tanks. So, if you do not live in town, and I'm putting that in air quotes that you can't see, if you live in a place where there are sidewalks, or you live in a place where there are apartment buildings or lots of businesses, you probably have where you don't have any of those things, you probably have a septic system. So, septic systems are pretty common in rural areas, and a septic system is pretty simple. You've got a toilet in the house, and from that toilet there is a little line that goes out to somewhere in your yard where there is a big tank, and into that tank go the poops. We like to call them biological solids, but let's be serious. It's poop. And ideally what happens is the poop and the toilet paper and whatever your little cousin Jimmy flushed down the toilet last Christmas go out into the septic tank, and they settle to the bottom. And the water that's with them rises to the top, and it flows out the other end, and the solids stay behind. Like I said, the poop, the toilet paper, the Easter eggs that cousin Jimmy flushed down the toilet. And once a year, you get somebody to come suck all the solids out. They take them someplace, and life is good. Now, that water that's coming out the other end of the septic tank, of course, has to go someplace. And traditionally, it went to a little ditch or a stream. We've improved on that somewhat. But problems start to arise if you don't get that septic system cleaned out on a regular basis. And that brown material fills up, and pretty soon, you know what you've got? You've got biological solids, by which I mean poop, going right straight through the tank. And now you have a brown trout stream, and believe me, this is not the kind of trout stream where you want to go fishing. So that's a bad thing. Well, let's look at that Mill Creek watershed. This is part of the Mill Creek watershed. Does it look like a place where there would be septic tanks? I think they probably have sidewalks, and I think they probably have apartment buildings and businesses and stuff, and I suspect that they do not, in fact, have septic tanks. Let's zoom out a little bit. Yeah, I'm going to say that some of that area probably has septic tanks, down in this part of the Mill Creek watershed. But I'm going to say that a lot of it is probably dealing with their poop some other way. Aha! What happens if you live where there are sidewalks and lots of gas stations and apartment buildings and things like that? Well, you probably have a city sewer system. So in a sewer system, hey, this looks a lot like it does look a little bit like the septic tank. So in a setup with a city sewer system, you have toilets that are connected to lines, and from those lines, from all those houses, all of the biological solids travel to a main central line, and from that main central line, they're taken to the wastewater treatment plant. And at the wastewater treatment plant, the idea is pretty similar. The idea being that the solids settle out in a series of tanks and it's through a series of filters, and water that if everything's going well, is 100% clean is discharge. And wastewater treatment plants always discharge their water to a stream. They have to. So the Columbiana wastewater treatment plant discharges to Mill Creek. There are lots of wastewater discharges on Mill Creek, on the Mahoning River. There's even one in the North Fork of Little Beaver Creek watershed. New Waterford's wastewater treatment plant discharges to Bull Creek. Is that okay? Yeah, it is. Now, keep in mind that we've gotten a lot smarter about dealing with poop, and the wastewater treatment plants that existed 50 or 60 years ago were not nearly as good at removing that poop. Well, they've gotten better. Okay, so in a lot of cases, the wastewater treatment plant isn't the big concern. But the septic systems, they're still a bit of a problem. In some watersheds, it's estimated that 30 to 50% of all septic systems are failing, meaning they're putting poop right in the water. Ew! Now, if we've got poop in the water and right there is a nice hot steaming pile of it, something's going to happen to it. Poop doesn't stay poop forever. What does poop do? Poop decomposes. How does poop decompose? Bacteria. Bacteria eat it! That's how poop decomposes. Yeah! So there are bacteria in the water and they're eating the poop? They sure are. And guess what those bacteria need? Oxygen. Well, there's only so much oxygen in the water to begin with. And remember that the hellbenders need a lot of it. When that poop enters the water, some of those bacteria that go to work eating the poop suck up the oxygen. And that lowers the oxygen that's available for the hellbenders. But poop isn't all bad, right? Well, no, as a matter of fact, it's not. If you're a gardener, you may have used composted manure as a fertilizer. It's fantastic stuff. It helps vegetables grow. And in a stream, it helps algae grow. Oh, well, that's not good. This stuff that looks like green shag carpeting, that's algae. And when you see a whole lot of algae growth in a stream, it typically means that there are extra nutrients. Could be from poop, could be from a few other sources, in the stream. We call this an algal bloom, and guess what? Everything that blooms has to die. And when the algae dies, it decomposes. And sure enough, those same bacteria will eat the algae, and as they do so, they suck up oxygen. Darn it! So you remember Lanterman's Mills? That's this beautiful place where Bill Whitehouse used to watch the hellbenders getting it on in the pool underneath the falls. Well, Lanterman's Mills is right there. And that's smack dab in a whole lot of urban and suburban development. Well, we have sources of nutrients there. It might not be septic tanks, and the wastewater treatment plant discharges someplace else, but we've got animal waste from pets whose owners don't pick up after them. We've also got something that we don't see as much of in rural settings, which is nutrients applied to lawns that then wash off and into the stream. Both of these things can cause algae blooms. Oh, extra nutrients aren't good. The green line is the outline of Mill Creek Park, and that's pretty protected and forested, but boy, that blue outline, that's the watershed that drains to the creek, and in that watershed, we've got a lot of problems. Now, don't think that the urban and suburban parts of Mill Creek are the only place where we run into problems with poop or just excess nutrients in the water. Farm fields, like those ones out near Columbiana and in Beaver Township, don't get a free pass either. Spreading manure on fields is great. It's a good way to use manure and fertilize crops. But manure spread at the wrong time, or spread too near creeks, or spread when the ground is frozen so it runs off with the melt, puts that poop straight in the water. Oh dear. We haven't even talked about a few of the other sources of nutrients to Mill Creek yet. But as you can see, Mill Creek is kind of that trouble child. Mill Creek has a hard time being a healthy watershed because it's got a lot of issues. So, going forward, we're going to examine how all these things are connected and how they're connected to the hero of our story, the hellbender. Stay tuned for the next installment.